I'm going to try and give you guys a crash course, more or less, in ecology in under an hour, which is rather intimidating. You have no idea. But so it's really going to end up being more of kind of a taster as we go through some of the different subfields of ecology. And you know, when I was preparing for this talk, I was emailing back and forth with Carolyn, and what I did a lot of was actually watching some of the previous talks from your previous boot camps. And one of the ones that I watched was the physics boot camp presentation. And I remember it very well because at the beginning, the speaker said, you know, physics is all about trying to find one simple rule. You're trying to reduce everything to a really basic equation, and the simpler, the better. That's what we want, is one little theory of everything. And all I can say is that I kind of feel like ecology is the antidote to that. Ecology, in my mind, is really all about acknowledging the complexity in the world. It might be very nice if we had some simple rules. It would make my life a lot easier, but that's just simply not how it works. So we're really trying to incorporate all that complexity. And I'd be willing to bet that about 90% of the time, if you ask an ecologist, what's going to happen if I do this? They're going to start their sentence answer to you very helpfully with something like, well, you know, it really depends. Because in ecology, context is everything. And hopefully that's one of the things you'll come out of this talk with. So just to give kind of a brief introduction to the definition of ecology, the ecology is the study of the distribution and abundance of organisms, so of living things, and the interactions of those organisms with their biotic, so that's their living, and their abiotic, their non-living environment. And ecology is very broad. It's much more than just environmental science or conservation biology. It has a very theoretical underpinning as well. And you have a huge variety of researchers that call themselves ecologists. It's really very interdisciplinary. As an ecologist, you're likely to have a good understanding of other fields such as genetics, chemistry, mathematics, medicine in some cases, because if we're looking at disease spread, that's actually an ecological question. Those are living organisms. Also things even like engineering, because as ecologists, because it's not the #1 field out there, a lot of the time we can't get the equipment we want out of a magazine. So these students over here are actually building their own field equipment. They're building little tech cards for recording climatic information in the field. And you're likely to find ecologists in a ton of different environments all over the world in the field, counting organisms, recording where they are, but also in the laboratory, running smaller experiments, or even in greenhouses, and very much so on computers, which I didn't include a picture of because I feared that wasn't as exciting. But a lot of the time it's actually spent on a computer as well, doing a lot of statistical modeling, because ecology actually gets very mathematical depending on what area you're in. So one of the things I'm going to repeatedly emphasize about ecology is exactly how complex it is. Ecological studies have to consider not just all the different living things that you're interested in, all living things on Earth, but also everything that they're interacting with. So for comparison, we have physics, where you have approximately 13 fundamental pieces, if you count all the quarks and everything that they've identified to date. You're looking at chemistry, you have 118 elements. Well, in ecology, we have approximately, we think, 10 million or so species on the face of the planet. And those species have trillions of populations. And what's more is that we've only identified approximately 2 million of those species that have actually been described, and we're describing about 15,000 more of them every single year. So what this means is that in ecology, there's a lot still yet to be done. It's very much a growing field, and we've only just begun to sink the teeth into the full extent of the life that's truly out there. So in order to deal with all this complexity, one of the things that we've done in ecology is kind of build this hierarchy that you see shown up here on the screen. And the different subfields in ecology are often kind of identified along with this hierarchy. So I'm going to try and walk through it as I go through the rest of the presentation today. In general, the smallest unit that we work with as ecologists, our fundamental unit, is really individual. And you'll have ecologists who study individual organisms, focusing on things like the physiology and the behavior of those organisms to try and figure out how they manage to survive in their environment. When we move on up beyond that, you start to have what we call populations, which are collections of organisms of the same species living in an area. Okay, and that's actually the area that I focus most on, so I'll probably give you a bit more information on that than some of the other areas. Beyond that, we have our communities, which is where you have multiple populations of different species all existing together in an area. So for example, all the fish species in a pond would be an example of a community. If you move even further beyond that to the ecosystem level, we start to actually specifically and directly address the influence of the non-living factors in the environment. So now we take the abiotic and we add it into all the biotic factors we were considering before. And we start looking at landscapes and regions, really large scales. And then finally, at the upper end of all this, we have the biosphere. So that includes basically all life on Earth. Okay, and that's where we start to really see and realize some of the big impacts that humans are having. So as I move through talk today, I'm going to basically start over here and kind of move in this direction, focusing more on some areas than others. And I'm also going to tack on some conservation biology at the end, because that's a very important subfield of ecology, and try and talk about where ecology is going to be moving in the future. So let's start at the individual level. At the individual level, ecologists will typically focus on either the physiology or the behavior of the organisms that they're studying. They're really trying to figure out how those living things actually fit in their environment and how they manage to survive and reproduce there. Because ultimately, that's what means that their genes go on to the next generation. So for example, this monkey up here, his name is Bubka. And I followed him and his troop around for about a year when I was in South America. And one of my main jobs was to record what he was eating. That's a flower of a plant. I think it's from an Astrocarium species, but I don't completely remember now. Flower from a plant that he was eating. I had to record that, and I had to record what individuals he was interacting with. Because one of the things we wanted to know was, how do these monkeys learn which foods to eat? They're not born with it. They learn it by watching other individuals. Is it by watching family members or those that are less related? And so that was one of the things that we were trying to figure out. Now, traditionally in behavioral ecology, a lot of the methods used have really relied on that kind of direct observation, being there to see the individuals that you're interested in. But more and more, actually, that's changing. We have new methods that are really connecting the behavioral aspect with physiology as well. So, for example, researchers will work with hormonal analyses in order to get at how stressed individuals are, if they're under a lot of stress in their environment currently, or perhaps whether or not a female is ready to start mating. You can get that from hormonal analysis. Also, we'll look at genetic studies, because you're trying to figure out how related individuals are. That monkey's not jumping up and telling me who his mom and dad are, but genetics can help me do that. Additionally, when we're working with behavioral studies, more and more methods are moving toward remote methods of studying that are less invasive. So ways that we don't need to be right there on top of the organism and perhaps disturbing it. And things that we would include in that area include methods that are more remote. I don't think I actually have a working pointer here. Include things like using radio collars or GPS collars that can tell us exactly where an individual is at a given point in time. Can also tell us who they're associating with. Using things like tracks or hair samples that individuals have left behind. We can actually get genetics from some of those things, and it tells us where they've been. So what kind of habitat they're using. And finally, slightly less appetizing, but over here in the corner, we have a fecal sample. This is a veritable gold mine for ecologists. This is great. From this, I can learn things like what the organism who put it there was eating, right? I can also learn potentially if he was in good health, if he had many parasites. I can learn things about his genetics because he left some of his own DNA on that sample. I can also potentially sample its hormones if I want, and once again, figure out if that's an individual under stress or in a time in its life when it's ready to breed. But finding these fecal samples can be rather difficult. They're not jumping out at you, they're not making noise, so if you think finding a monkey is hard, finding that is harder. So we've come up with some kind of unique ways to locate them. We've had to get creative. Now, when I was in Central America, I worked on a study where we were trying to use a lot of these remote methods. And actually, one of the researchers I was working with was Claudia Wolch. And her job as a student then was to try and find a lot of these fecal samples of jaguars. And she was using a very then unique and up-and-coming method to do it. And what it was is she had a dog. And the dog was named Bruiser. And he was trained specifically to find cat feces. Not feces by anything else, he'd walk right past it. But cat feces, this guy could zero in on, kind of like if you had a drug dog at an airport. And shortly after she worked with me in South America, she actually went to Bhutan, and luckily she was recorded doing some of her work. So I'm going to give you a bit of an idea of what this looks like. I'm going to have to skip to that point in the video, so just bear with me, because we're not watching the whole thing. Starts right
the tiger.
There. So his name's
Are
Bruiser.
the ones made by wild elephants. They keep Bruiser close. He's one of a few dogs trained to find big cats, and he does it by sniffing out their droppings, or scats.
Bruiser's just coursing ahead of us with his nose down close to the ground, searching out those scents. I'm really just hoping that we'll come across a scat that is definitive, that you have to say is going to be a tiger.
Bruiser can sniff out even the tiniest remains of a cat scat. Steve and Claudia have to work out which species it belongs to.
Oh, look what he's found.
What did you find? Such a good boy, Bruiser, come down.
Bruiser's rewarded with his favourite toy.
Good boy. Good boy, Bruiser.
Well, that's absolutely full of interesting stuff. Lots of little feathers here. In fact, most of what I can see looks like bird to me. What do you think?
Could be clouded leopard.
Clouded leopard, yeah, absolutely. This isn't tiger scat, you can say that for 100% certainty. But, it could be from a leopard or a clouded leopard, both of which are pretty exciting for us.
Hi, Booty.
Bruiser's on great form. But evidence that tigers live here might be harder to find.
If I can stop this.
Tigers.
So that's really what it's like when you find one of those scats in the forest. And the great thing about using a dog to do this is that we don't need to interfere with the individual. We never have to capture that tiger and put a collar on him, never have to do any of that, because that's really rather traumatic for the animal. This is totally non-invasive, and yet we still get all that information I was talking about that is so, so valuable to us. There we go. All right, so once we understand how individuals survive, it makes sense to then look at a larger group and see how groups of individuals are doing. And that's basically what a population is. A population is a group of individuals, all of the same species, living in an area so that they have the potential to actually breed with one another. And population ecology is really kind of my area of focus. So I'm a little bit biased, but I'm going to go out there and say that one of the great things about population ecology is that it has huge practical applications and is really widely used by wildlife managers and conservationists because they need to know how populations are doing in order to be able to assess their conservation needs and also in order to manipulate their population growth for the future. So if you have an endangered species and you want to increase that population, you have to understand population ecology. If you want to control a pest population and reduce it, you're in the same situation. You need to understand how populations work. Now, a really good example of the need to understand the growth of a population comes from this huge fish right there. This is a Nile perch, and they're one of the most harmful invasive vertebrates in the world. They can grow to be over 400 pounds. So they're huge. They're also voracious predators of other small fish, and they've been introduced all over the world, but one infamous example of their introduction comes from Lake Victoria, so that tiny little, it looks tiny on the map, it's actually a really big lake, in eastern Africa that you see marked out with a little pin up in the corner. Well, these fish were introduced to Lake Victoria in the 1950s and 1960s by a British colonel who really just wanted them for sport fishing. So he threw them in the lake, and we don't know exactly how many of them went in, but it was probably fewer than 100, maybe as few as 35 individuals. Now, the thing is that those 35 individuals did incredibly well. We didn't expect it at the time, but, well, that population went from nothing to a point where we could actually extract more than 25,000 tons of Nile perch per year in terms of fisheries. And to give you an idea of what that growth looks like, this blue line represents the growth in the percentage of the fishery coming out of that lake that was from Nile perch. Now, at the same time, what happened is that a lot of the local fish are known as, they're a very diverse group of fish known as cichlids. The local fish declined because guess what? The Nile perch was eating them all, right? So we had a lot of problems, and actually the Nile perch eventually contributed to the near extinction or extinction of more than 200 species in that lake. Now, at the time, we couldn't really predict that this was going to happen, but nowadays, with our understanding of population ecology, I can tell you exactly why it happened. It happened because this guy, these fish, can lay approximately 9 million eggs in one batch. And those eggs will hatch in approximately 20 hours. And of course, when we put him in this lake, he had no natural predators other than us. So he had ideal conditions, and the population grew really quickly. And it's really important that we are able to understand situations like that so that we can understand where populations are going to go in the future and try to control that if necessary. Come on, there we go. So, a lot of the time, one of the first steps in studies of population ecology is to go out and actually estimate that population size because it tells us how well it's doing. Well, this includes a lot of counting. It can get very, very tedious. Not to mention, it's not always actually possible to count all the individuals in the population that we're interested in. So we use a number of strategies to get around that. And that went too fast. There we go. One of the first things that we would love to be able to do is to conduct a census, which is a complete count of the population, every single individual. But for most cases, most species, that's really not possible. I mean, imagine going out on campus today and trying to count every individual. You would miss some, you'd double count others if you weren't paying close attention, and create a lot of problems. And it's the same with natural populations. So that's ideal, but it's really not possible. So oftentimes what we'll do instead is conduct a survey, which basically means that what we do is we go out and we sample a subset of the area. And we can do that in a number of ways, but typically we designate a certain size plot, so it might be something like this quadrat that you see up there. And you're going to go and do a large number of those plots at random locations throughout your study area. And you're going to count the individuals within that, and then try to extrapolate from those numbers to your whole area of interest. using an average or perhaps more complicated statistical techniques. And basically what that does is help us to kind of minimize the effort that needs to be put in to get the same result. However, that can be a problem too. If you actually look at these researchers there, they're probably trying to count something like barnacles or algae on a rocky intertidal shore area. Well, those barnacles and that algae, they're not moving around. They're also relatively easy to pick out. This changes when you have other organisms. For example, a lot of organisms have really good camouflage. Like how many of you can pick out the stick insect in the figure up there in that picture? Right? He blends in really well. He does not want to be counted. He doesn't care that you want to know his population size. And if you look up in this corner over here, we have another lizard who blends in incredibly well with the leaf litter that forms his habitat. And if you walk up and you try to count him, he's probably going to run under that leaf litter and hide from you. So that can be a problem. And then even with organisms that are relatively easy to see, the sheer numbers and their movement can make it hard to count them as well. So for example, if I asked you to right now count these zebra for me. Your time. So yeah, if I asked you to count those zebra for me, it's not so easy. And then actually on top of that, I also want you to tell me the sex and age of all the individuals. All right? So that doesn't work so well. So we need to come up with some methods to get around that. And one of the really common methods that's used is something called capture, mark, recapture techniques. Okay, and they're a really powerful technique, and they can get very mathematical, and I'm not going to do that to you. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the idea of it. So bear with me. Basically, these techniques mathematically account for the fact that some individuals in your population are not going to be counted. You're going to miss them. They still exist. You still want to know they exist, but you're not going to be able to count them. And mathematically, we want to account for that fact. Now, the basic way in which capture, mark, recapture techniques work is that the first thing you're going to do is go into your population. So in this case, I have a population of these circle creatures up there in the larger rectangle. And I'm going to take a sample from that area. And it could have any number of individuals when I take that sample. And when I do that, I'm going to count the number of individuals that I take out of there. But of course, this isn't the number I really want to know. What I want to know is the larger population. So what I'm going to do then is mark these individuals in some way. So these were them up there. Here I'm going to make them gray. I've given them some kind of marking that I'll be able to recognize in the future. So the next thing that I'm going to do is throw them back in the population. Not physically throw, just release them nicely. So I'm going to put them back in the population, and I'm going to allow them to intermix. Okay, I want them to go forth and do their thing. Next step, I'm going to return some period of time later, and I'm going to sample that population again. And I'm going to pull out a new group of individuals. Guess what? Some will be ones I've seen before, some won't be. And I'm going to record the number of individuals that I get total, in addition to the number of those individuals that have my marks. So here I have 2 gray circles that tell me, hey, guess what? I've seen you guys before. And when I know that number and the number of my sample, it tells me the proportion in that sample that I had seen before. And basically, I can say that the proportion here is likely to be equal to the proportion of that whole population that I marked in the first place. Okay, so we're making a very basic assumption that that sample is representative of the larger population. And that's represented by this equation up here, which is not so critical that you understand. But basically, I had a first sample of 10 individuals, and then I took another sample of 10 individuals. 2 of them were marked. So this is my 20% here. And I can assume that that 10 individuals I originally marked was approximately 20% of the population. work with that mathematics, and I get a nice estimate of around 50 individuals in that population. It's a really powerful technique. You would typically go back and do this many, many times. Mathematics would get more complicated, but it works pretty well. I think there are about 45 individuals in that figure up there. So it gives you a pretty good estimate. So that's a really common method used in population studies. Now there are a number of different ways that you can mark individuals, right? That mark is really important. You need it to stick around. Well, we use a lot of different methods. We can use ear tags, for example, often on larger mammals, like you see with that deer up there. You can also use things like ring bands for putting around birds. You can see a little metal band is being placed around the leg of this guy. And in some cases, we'll actually physically alter the individuals. So actually, this is a little bit more gruesome, but this little lizard there has had some of his toes removed in a certain pattern, something called toe clipping. And it sounds gruesome, but they've done a lot of work looking at it, and it doesn't seem that it hurts them that much. So it is a method that is pretty commonly used. Sometimes, however, we can do better than that, and we can use natural markings. And when we can do that, that's great, because once again, it's less invasive, so we don't need to bother the organisms as much. And this is actually some of what I did when I was working in Central America. We used remote camera traps, like you see up there, so the organism walks by and we get a photograph. Well, we were looking at trying to get a population estimate for jaguars. Nice thing about jaguars, they have spots. Those spot patterns are kind of like a fingerprint on a human. It's unique to each and every individual. So I can tell you that this guy right here, his name is Strider. It's 2 different locations, and this is the same cat with the same spot pattern. We saw a lot of him throughout the study. He was a large male who really got around the study site. Having things like that is great, and guess what? It works on other organisms like tigers or even the zebra that we were looking at earlier. They all have unique patterns. Now, these techniques are often used over long periods of time to try and monitor population growth and also survival. And having long-term data is really important because it allows us to answer questions that are of real interest to managers. So the data that you're seeing up here are actually some of the data I worked with for my PhD, and they came from a roe deer population in Sweden. They were collected over a period of, I'd say, 20 or so years by some of my collaborators. I actually did very little of the field work to get this data. My main job as a student was to then work with this data and try to help us understand how this population was likely to respond to climate change. That's what we wanted to know. So my first task was to build a model of the population that could replicate historical patterns in population growth. So I wanted to build a rule, an equation that would basically say this is how this population has been growing over time, and this is why. And what you're seeing in this figure up here is actually the model that I built, represented by this red line, compared to the recorded data, which are represented by that black line. And you can see that actually it did a reasonably good job of capturing some of the changes in population size. Have a peak, a lull, and then a nice kind of growth curve up as the population started to recover from being cold there when it dropped down. Okay, so I built this model. It was linked up with climatic factors, things like temperature and things like that, and how they affect the roe deer population. And once we have a model like that, we can then project roe deer population growth over the next century, or however long we want really, in response to climate change. And that was, in fact, the next thing that I did. And so this figure up here actually represents the projected roe deer population growth in Sweden, in the site I was working at, with different levels of climate change. And those are just slightly different scenarios that you see up there, a more extreme climate change scenario and then some that are less extreme. And you can see that basically what the models suggest is that the roe deer population is going to increase a lot. All right? And what this tells us is that Well, roe deer are going to do okay with climate change, but also it seems like controlling those populations is going to be a real issue in Sweden in the future. They're likely going to need to harvest them more or consider other natural techniques of control. What's great about having models like this is that they're rather flexible. So I can take this model and then I can consider the impacts of predators if I want, the impacts of changes in food resources, or even disease. And all of those are things a manager might be interested in. Okay, so that's kind of the population level. If we're going to move on up, we talk now about community and ecosystem ecology. It's kind of the next step up from the populations. And, in my mind, community and ecosystem ecologists, and I'm going to say this knowing there are a couple in the room, are really suckers for pain. Because, it's hard enough working with one population of one species, and then you're going to throw even more species into the mix. And then start including the abiotic environment as well. That's no easy task. A community is basically a collection of populations of different species existing in the same time and place. So all these species have the potential to interact and to impact one another. And many of the research questions that community ecologists will address are going to focus on things like how many species are there out there, or what is the biodiversity of an area, and why is it there? All right, where are we finding it? And you can actually see a map of this up on the screen. This is a map of the number of species found across the planet's surface. And you can see that in the red and yellow areas, these are the peaks, whereas the blue areas toward either pole, we have fewer species. That pattern is called the latitudinal diversity gradient. It's a really well-known pattern in ecology. And for a long time, we've been trying to figure out exactly why it is what it is. It's a major question. Number of different theories have been put forth. None of them represent a complete answer. Many of them work, but it's still a very active area of study. Now, moving on beyond that to the ecosystem level, ecosystem ecologists will often try and look at how the abiotic non-living environment is actually impacting those communities and how well they're functioning. So they're going to look at things like how energy and matter move through systems, how nutrients travel through your living systems, things like nitrogen or phosphorus, for example. And when you start considering that, you start to see all the big consequences of environmental change that humans are causing come out, right? So a lot of ecosystem ecologists are going to start considering what the impacts of environmental change are. And by that, I don't just mean climate change, but also things like changes in land use, urbanization, deforestation, for example, pollution. All of those questions become very, very important at this level. And so just to give us a bit of a common background as I move forward talking about an example in this area, we have some illustrations up here of the expected warming with climate change. And, we know that climate change is happening. The question is exactly how much warming and other changes are going to take place with that climate change. And we don't know the answer to that completely. It could be a lot, it could be a little bit less. A lot of it depends on your levels of carbon dioxide increase and other greenhouse gases. So if you have a relatively low concentration of carbon dioxide increase, like you see in the top row right here, then you're likely to have a temperature increase of around 4 degrees in some areas in the world. And you can see that in the figure in the upper right hand here. If, on the other hand, carbon dioxide increases are much higher, you're more likely to have changes upwards of around 7 degrees Celsius across the globe in different areas. And it's not evenly spread, but that's what we're expecting to see. And it's not just changes in temperature, but it's also going to be changes in precipitation patterns and other things that take place. So one of the main questions that ecosystem and community ecologists want to ask is exactly how this is going to impact our living systems. Now, one of the impacts that we're already seeing a lot of across the globe, we already know this is happening, are shifts in species distributions. So basically, you have one geographic range for a species, and it's moving. And in most cases, those species appear to be moving toward the poles. So they're moving either northward or southward, depending on which hemisphere they're in. Essentially, they're moving because they're following the temperature change. Where they have been in the past is now too warm for them, so they're going to move to a cooler area. But what we don't know, because we don't know how warm it's going to get, is exactly where that movement is going to stop, right? So one of the things that we do is try and project those changes, those geographic shifts in their distributions. And a common technique that we use to do this is called species distribution modeling, okay? And I'm going to kind of run you through it very briefly just up here. The first step, if you're doing species distribution modeling, is that you want to look at the range of the species you're interested in. So up here we have the white-rumped falcon found in Southeast Asia. And its geographic range, historically, is shown there in red. That's where it's found. Well, I can assume that those areas all generally have had good climate for this species, what we call suitable climatic characteristics. And I can actually overlay that on a map and try and identify those good climate characteristics in areas that would be good for that species. And that's what you're seeing here. Some areas have good climate, but it's not found there. Well, those areas might be cities or something else. Okay? Next thing you do is take your projections of future climate, like those that you saw for temperature on the previous slide, and figure out what areas are going to be good for this species in the future. And this is what we get for the white-rumped falcon. So whereas before it was located down here in Southeast Asia, you can see that now there's actually been a northward shift in its range. So this is a projection for about 85 years in the future for this species, where it's going to find good climate. But of course, that's just one species. We want to know more than that. So the next thing you can do is look at it for many species. Do that same process for a bunch of different species, and then put it all on one map. And what this can tell us is what areas are going to gain species and what areas are going to lose species. And we get both consequences. On this map, we have the blue areas are actually gaining in the overall number of species. Realize they're probably not the same species that were there before. Those might have moved elsewhere. And then you see a lot of other areas that are losing species. Most areas are either red or blue. They're not white. That's telling us that basically these communities are likely to look very different in the future from how they look now. But of course, these models don't take into account everything, because the picture is more complex than that. They don't consider, for example, land use change. Are humans going to build parking lots over those areas? Can that species actually move fast enough to get there and keep up with climate change? Are its food resources going to move with it? They might go somewhere else, right? Are its predators going to move with it? All these are interesting questions that we are still working to incorporate in these models. So they're getting more complicated all the time. A lot of researchers are working on that. Ultimately, what all this means is that ecology is really destined to be a very applied field. Because as ecologists, sometimes it's really hard not to get involved with the environmental problems that you are running into in your research. Okay, and that makes conservation biology, the kind of last subfield of ecology I'm going to talk about, makes it somewhat of a gray area. Because of course, as scientists, you're not supposed to advocate for anything in particular. But that becomes difficult, and it's actually part of the mission of what I would say is conservation and management in ecology. The goal of conservation and management in ecology is generally to protect what we call biodiversity, so that's the sum total of diversity of all species on the planet, and also to protect what we call ecosystem services, which are basically all the different things that we as humans benefit from from the natural world around us. So we're trying to protect those resources so that humans can continue to exist. Now, there are a number of different ways that people approach conservation biology, and a lot of the time it can just mean, you'll hear them talk about kind of saying, okay, well, this area needs protecting, so we're going to try and minimize human influence in that area. Okay, we're going to set it aside and conserve it. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you have to get more proactive than that. So I'm going to try and briefly touch on both of these approaches. So one of the number one problems in conservation biology is we can't protect everything. We don't have enough funding. We don't have enough resources to do everything we want to do. So we have to prioritize it in some way. And an organization called Conservation International has actually gone ahead and done that for us. Essentially what they've done is identify approximately 35 areas across the face of the planet, 35 land areas, that are known as the biodiversity hotspots. And these 35 land areas that you see in red up there represent only 2.3% of the Earth's surface. But you'd be really hard-pressed to find another 2.3% that's as valuable. Because in these land areas, you have approximately 50% of the Earth's plant species as endemics, meaning that those plant species exist there and only there. You lose these areas, you lose half of the Earth's plant species. Similarly, they have approximately 43% of the Earth's birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and mammals as endemics, I think, too. So these are really valuable areas. They're irreplaceable. But that wasn't the only criteria they used in designating them. They also identified them because these areas have less than a third of their original habitat remaining. So these areas are extremely threatened. And so what this tells us as conservation biologists is that this is where we're going to put a lot of our effort, is in protecting these areas. Okay? But remember I just said it's not always going to work to just set areas aside. Sometimes these places actually need more active help recovering. We have to take a more proactive approach. So when that happens, when you have a species that's really close to endangered, close to extinction, and it can't seem to recover on its own, we have to come up with a number of methods to kind of get involved and to help pull it out of that slump. And one of the common things that will be done in really extreme situations is captive breeding. Okay, so ecologists will actually go into the field and they'll basically take the few remaining individuals or some of the few remaining individuals of an endangered species and bring them into captivity because we're going to encourage them to breed with one another, or at least that's the goal. Now, in order to do this, you have to know a lot about their physiology and behavior, right? You have to create a nice romantic atmosphere for the individuals. It's very important. Actually, that's harder than you think. So China at this point has a really successful breeding program for pandas, but it took them approximately 8 years before they had a successful birth, just because the pandas didn't seem to know what to do, all right, or they weren't interested in breeding. So there are a lot of challenges involved in that, but it's also worth it when we do it because it's now considered a very successful program. There have been a number of good births from that program. Now, once we have those individuals, the next thing we might think about is reintroductions or translocations. So you have a population in one area that's not doing well, but maybe you have a good population of that species somewhere else. So maybe you're going to take some individuals from one population, move it to that area, or maybe you have a population that has been extirpated from an area. So it's gone extinct in one region, and guess what? We're going to bring some more captive bred individuals and try and release them there. Well, we can do that, but then as ecologists, you run into even more problems, and you have to be even more interdisciplinary. Because guess what? Now you're going to run into a lot of problems with human-wildlife conflicts. A lot of those species aren't there anymore because humans didn't want them there. They were pests or predators. They were considered a danger. So you need to try and work with communities to find out a way that this is going to be a good thing for everyone involved. and that can be a huge challenge. Additionally, if they're captive bred individuals, they might not know how to live in the wild anymore, so sometimes we have to train them as well. And this is all challenging, but it can be really worth it in terms of the larger effects on the overall community. So for this reason, a lot of conservation work in ecology is moving more and more in the direction of what I would call ecological restoration, meaning basically that we're trying to get systems that have been altered by humans back to a more or less natural state where they're functioning in a self-sustaining manner on their own. And a really great example of this kind of strategy is actually Yellowstone National Park and the surrounding ecosystem. Yellowstone National Park is being managed now with a much more hands-off approach. What they're trying to do is actually allow the large predators to come back. So not just the reintroduction of wolves that we're all familiar with, but also making sure the grizzly bears and the mountain lions are doing well. And they're also doing things like allowing natural wildfires to take place. Whereas in the past they would have controlled them, now this is recognized as a good thing that is actually necessary for that system. And all of this means that these systems are returning more and more to what we hope was closer to their natural state. So that's my very brief overview of some of the subfields in ecology. And I think one of the things that you can hopefully pick up from that is that truly specializing in just one area in ecology is actually really difficult because it overlaps with all the other areas and other sciences on the side. And if you go through your research life with blinders on, you're often going to miss a lot of the important questions and important components of the answer that you're looking for. And I think this is very much reflected in the direction that ecology is taking now and is going to continue to take in the future. A lot of the current work in ecology is moving more and more so that it's dominated by looking at environmental change. Okay, we as humans are having ever more and more substantial effects on the environment. So one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how all of this is going to work out and how it can be managed. But we're trying to do that with a much more holistic mindset than we have in the past. So not just concentrating on one species and really narrowing in on it, but actually looking at all the other factors around it. So for example, when I was studying roe deer for my PhD, we were looking not just at climate's effect on roe deer, but the effect of climate on vegetation on roe deer, and the effect of predators that were being reintroduced to the area on roe deer, and the potential effect of hunting desires for the future. All of that had to be taken into account. Another major route for ecology in the future that's really taking off is what I'm going to call big data, which is basically a reference to the fact that we now have this wonderful internet and globalization, and it's making data sharing easier. Okay, whereas in the past, a lot of the questions we wanted to answer were really limited by a lack of data. We needed a lot more than we had. Now that's becoming less and less the case because we're all connected through the internet and things are becoming more available. So to give you an idea, an example of this, this is the collection, the biodiversity collection at UConn. We have some specimens here, probably of snakes and reptiles in jars, and then some paleontological specimens of ferns and things here. Well, it used to be that if you wanted to go to a museum collection and actually study those, you had to physically go there. That's not so much the case anymore. A lot of the data that we have on these specimens is now available online, widely for anybody. Even things like high-resolution images of these specimens are available for people to look at. So you can get a lot of what you need to know just by logging on. And another great thing that's happening with this is using what we call citizen science. All right, so everyday people that are interested in nature, they go on a walk, they identify organisms as they walk, or maybe they don't know what they are, but they want help identifying them. Well, there are actually a number of apps. I think this is one called iNaturalist, but there are a number of apps that can help you to do that and to enter where you saw a particular organism at a particular time. Well, that gets entered into a huge database that is then available for ecological research. That's a huge amount of data across the entire world that's becoming available to us on distributions. There's also a lot of data coming in the form of remote sensing and eDNA, which I'm going to talk about very briefly. So to give you an idea of what I mean by remote sensing, there are all these satellites circling the globe, right? Well, they're not there purely for ecological purposes, but they're picking up on a lot of ecological data. For example, what you see up here is actually the reflection of green light from the Earth's surface. It's showing us the green up that you have with spring and summer in the northern summer, and the green up that you see in southern summer down here. And this data is generally available for every bit of the Earth's surface and every 24 hours to anyone. So there we can see vegetation growth. We can look at the impacts of climate change on that. We can actually look for invasive species in some cases using this. We can look at water quality. There are any number of different questions that can be answered looking at this, and we don't actually have to go out there and measure the vegetation ourselves. One final source of this big data that I want to talk about is something called eDNA, or environmental DNA, which is basically this idea that you can go out into the environment, you can take a sample of something like water or air or soil, and that sample is going to have all these different fragments of DNA from any number of different species, because as an organism is moving about, he's shedding DNA throughout the day. So, for example, I could go to a pond, take a water sample, and by looking at all the different DNA fragments there, I could get an idea of the diversity of fish species in that pond without ever having to actually go and find a fish. All right? Similarly, one of the cooler things I've seen done with this, you can look at samples of honey from a beehive and figure out what wildflowers are in the area, or even what insects are pollinating those wildflowers because there are fragments of DNA in it. So you can start to look at whole community applications and species interactions using this kind of information. The amount of data available to us is absolutely staggering. That being said, we're always learning more, and oftentimes, because ecology is a relatively new field, we go out into the field and observe something and it completely flips the ecological world on its head, and we have to go back and start with our theoretical explanations from step one. So it is very much a growing field, and something that we're just beginning to scratch the surface of. And with that, I'd like to thank all my colleagues back at UConn who have helped me kind of put a lot of this together, a number of people who have actually shared slides directly with me for this purpose. I'm very lucky to have had a lot of support doing that, and a number of other funding sources at UConn. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. The original plan was to do Q&A at the very end with both of our speakers together. We are running a bit early. My announcements were pretty short. So let me just check and see if coffee is set up. In the meantime, if you want to take a question or two.
I'm happy to take questions if there are questions.
I'll be right back. And yes, we've got one over there, one over there. There's a little on button. Please speak into the mic.
Little PSA regarding microphones. I realize a lot of people feel uncomfortable about it, but it's an accessibility thing for anyone who might have a hearing or certain other kinds of accessibility needs, so, and also for recording. So please do speak into the mic. First question?
Hi, thank you. It was a great talk. Really exciting. This image right here kind of like speaks to me. What would you say if that was a PhD candidate finishing up year 4 of their PhD, and all of a sudden, things have turned around. What kind of advice do you have for that student?
Well, you would okay, so there's my off-the-cuff answer, which is that perhaps you need another year of research and figuring out what's going on with that system. But then, more realistically, you'd probably write it off as an anomalous observation. So you'd probably say, hey, you know, I saw this, it was really weird. These hares must have some gang behavior that should be investigated in the future. That would be pretty unrealistic, but I do love that cartoon.
Thank you. Yeah, because it does bring to mind the fact that we do have students, and they oftentimes talk to us,
Yeah.
and they're like, I'm studying this very specific species, and I've been studying it for 4 years. There's no other data on it, but due to climate change or whatever, all of a sudden there was like a huge change in rainfall amount.
Right.
And what do I do?
Well, so in a lot of those cases, then they're going to be looking at a specific case. So I would tell them to go back to the literature, see if they can find any similar situations like that they could link it to. And if not, what you do is actually write down those observations and say, hey, this was a unique situation, and here's what I found, and here's why it could be. So, and you would probably list then more than one possible explanation for what could be causing it, acknowledging that this is speculation.
Hi. Going back to your studying with the roe deer, how do you translate that kind of information to the human population? And not necessarily just the roe deer, but you know, the ecology that you find with the animal species, how do you translate to what's happening with humans?
Do you mean in terms of what humans should be doing in that situation to manage the roe deer, or do you mean in terms of human population growth?
Well, I'm a medical reference librarian, and so I try to translate to human populations. And so if this is happening with the deer, how is this affecting and what's going to happen to the humans that are around? There was climate change and food and vegetation.
So in Sweden, in that particular situation, there are a number of different things going on with that deer population, and the humans there have a variety of concerns about roe deer. Number one, they love the roe deer because they eat them. Right? They hunt them. It's really popular to go sport hunting there. And so that's a resource that actually they'd be pretty happy about. They're oftentimes more worried about the population going down. So I'd say, hey, guess what? You get to hunt more in the future, potentially. But we need to run some more models to see exactly how many. And you could give an estimate of hunting quotas from those models. Another thing that came into that was that in Sweden, people were really concerned about the fact that large predators were returning to the area. So things like wolves and lynx actually have recently returned to that study site. And one of the things they want to know is what the impacts of those predators were going to be on this game population that they wanted so badly. So one of the things I was able to say based on that is, hey, guess what? Yeah, these predators are eating the roe deer, and they are having an impact. But likelihood is that in the future, this isn't going to be a major problem for you. You're still going to have your hunting resource.
Thank you. I kind of meant, and it was the way I formulated the question, these same things that are affecting the roe deer are also affecting humans, not in the eating and hunting and stuff like that, but the climate change is also affecting the human population.
Okay, so, well, I mean, climate change, it's going to have a number of impacts on human populations, but I don't think they're going to be the same type that we were seeing with the roe deer. We're less dependent on temperature, determining our food resource in that way. But one of the things that we are seeing is that food resources are going to have to be grown in different areas for humans. Another major thing that's happening with climate change, I don't know if this is answering your question now, but is also disease spread is a huge thing with climate change. A lot of diseases that we used to consider tropical are not going to be tropical anymore because they're spreading north or southward.
Thank you.
Okay, we are set up upstairs. So as you exit this door, stairs to your left, elevator ahead and to the right in the alcove. And there may be someone coming back with iced tea, but the coffee and the snacks and everything's all set up. Thank you.